The night Seon Jae-won burned down everything he had built, the empire, the alliances, the name that made grown men lower their eyes in Seoul's Gangnam district. He did it without hesitation. He did it with a single phone call. And the only person who knew why was a woman named Zara Osei, standing barefoot in a hospital corridor in Itaewon, holding a paper cup of cold coffee, completely unaware that a man she had met only 4 months ago had just chosen her over everything. Over everything. Speech balloon. If you've ever loved something that cost you more than you planned to give, this story will reach into your chest and hold something there. Subscribe because the stories we tell here will find you exactly when you need them. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Zara Osei was not asleep. She rarely slept before 3 anymore, a habit she developed during her residency at Severance Hospital, where the fluorescent lights stayed on forever and the distinction between midnight and midday existed only in theory. She was seated at the narrow desk in her on-call room, reviewing a patient's chart, a half-eaten triangle of kimbap going stale beside her keyboard. Her personal phone buzzed. Unknown number. Seoul area code. She almost didn't answer. She had a policy about unknown numbers after 10 p.m., a policy born from 3 years of navigating life as a Ghanaian British woman in a city that occasionally reminded her, politely and sometimes not, that she was far from home. But something, a reflex she couldn't name, made her thumb press the green icon. Dr. Osei. The voice was low, measured, Korean accented English, each syllable deliberate, as if the speaker had learned the language by studying recorded conversations rather than living among them. There is a man. Second floor of the Itaewon RO parking structure. Level B2. He has been there for 40 minutes, and he is not breathing correctly. Zara straightened. Who is this? Someone who cannot take him to a hospital themselves. The line went dead. She sat for exactly 3 seconds. She counted later, when replaying the moment, before grabbing her emergency bag from the hook behind the door. She found him exactly where the voice had described. A man in his late 30s, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, sitting with his back against the concrete pillar in the lowest level of the parking structure. His tie was loosened. His right hand was pressed against his left side, just below the rib cage. His breathing was shallow and deliberate, the kind of breathing that people adopt when they're rationing air, when they know that a full breath will cost them. But it was his face that stopped her mid-stride for a half-second. He was extraordinarily still. Not the stillness of unconsciousness, the stillness of a person who had trained himself, over years, never to show what he felt. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of her footsteps, were dark and completely lucid. He looked at her the way a person looks at a door, noting it, assessing it, deciding whether to open it. "You called me," she said. Not a question. "I had someone call," he said. A precise distinction. "Can you move?" "Preferably not." She crouched beside him, snapped on gloves, and began her assessment with the kind of focused calm that her attending physician back in London had once described as unsettling in the best possible way. His pulse was elevated but strong. His pupils were reactive. The wound, and there was a wound, she confirmed when she carefully moved his hand, was a deep laceration, not a puncture, positioned just far enough from critical structures to be survivable, but close enough to demand immediate attention. "This needs sutures," she said. "Proper ones. You need imaging to rule out internal involvement." "No hospital." "Sir." "No hospital." He said it the same way both times. Not louder, not more forceful, simply repeated, as if the first instance had merely been warmth and this was the temperature itself. "Can you treat it here?" Zara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at what she had in her bag. Then she looked back at him. "I can stabilize you," she said. "That's the ceiling of what I'm offering in a parking garage at 3 in the morning." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. As if she had said something he hadn't expected, and the unexpectedness of it had briefly interrupted whatever script he was running inside his mind. "Then stabilize me," he said. His name, she learned over the following 40 minutes, was Seon Jae-won. She didn't learn it from him. She learned it from the second man who appeared 20 minutes into her work, a younger man in a dark jacket who appeared from the shadows of the upper ramp and stood at a careful distance, watching with the focused anxiety of someone who cared deeply about the outcome but had been instructed not to interfere. When he caught her eye, he gave a small bow and said, quietly, "Mr. Cian is very grateful." Mr. Cian. She filed the name away, without reacting to it. Later, much later, she would understand exactly what that name meant in certain circles of the city. The weight it carried. The silence it could produce in a room simply by being spoken aloud. But in that moment, in that concrete basement that smelled of motor oil and cold air, it was simply the name of a man who was watching her work with those impossibly calm eyes and occasionally, when she pressed somewhere that hurt, exhaled through his nose in a single controlled breath. "You're going to need to come in for imaging tomorrow," she said, finishing the last suture and taping a clean dressing over the site. "I'm serious about that." "You keep saying serious like it's a threat," he observed. "It is a threat," she said. "I'll be the one wondering all night whether you're bleeding internally, which means I won't sleep, which means I'll be irritable during rounds, which means my patients will suffer. So really, going for imaging is an act of charity." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, and this was the thing she would think about for weeks afterward, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Just the beginning of the acknowledgement that a smile was theoretically possible. "What time do you finish your shift?" he said. 7 a.m. "Someone will bring imaging results to the hospital by 8. She blinked. "You have a private radiologist." "I have resources," he said simply. She stood, stripped her gloves, and looked down at him, this man in his expensive suit with his careful breathing and his unreadable eyes. "Mr. Cian," she said, "I don't know who you are or what happened tonight, and I'm choosing not to ask either of those questions. But if you pull that dressing before morning, you'll undo everything I just did." "Understood. And drink water. You're dehydrated." This time, the corner of his mouth moved slightly further. She walked back to the hospital in the pale dark of pre-dawn Seoul, the streets of Itaewon quiet around her, the Han River somewhere to the south throwing back the glow of the city. Her hands had stopped trembling. They had trembled the whole drive over, the whole walk to the parking structure, the whole assessment. She had kept them steady through training and will, but they had trembled nonetheless. She told herself it was the adrenaline. She did not examine what else it might have been. The imaging results arrived at 7:58 a.m. Not electronically. Not via courier. A woman in her 50s, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being precisely where she was needed and nowhere else, appeared at the nurse's station and asked, in impeccable English, for Dr. Osei. She handed over a sealed envelope with both hands and a small bow, and was gone before Zara had fully processed what had happened. Inside was a radiological report, formal, detailed, signed by a physician whose credentials Zara later verified and found to be completely legitimate, along with a handwritten note on heavy cream paper. "No internal involvement. You were right about the dehydration. SJW." She read it twice. Then she tucked it into the pocket of her white coat and went to finish her rounds. She expected that to be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, a arrangement of flowers arrived at the hospital. Not roses, not the generic gestures of obligation, but a precise selection of proteas and white anthuriums that her colleague Dr. Hyun-soo held up with raised eyebrows when Zara came off the elevator. "Secret admirer?" Hyun-soo said. "Patient follow-up," Zara said, with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. There was no card, but she knew. A week after that, she was leaving the hospital at dusk when she noticed a car, a dark, understated sedan, parked across the street. Not waiting for her, as far as she could tell. Simply present. When she turned to look directly at it, it pulled smoothly away and was gone. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't sure what she was. The second time she saw Cian Jae-won in person, she was in a bookshop. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray pearl Seoul afternoon when the sky sits low and soft over the Han, and the whole city feels like it's thinking quietly to itself. She had wandered into a small independent bookshop near Hanam-dong that she'd been meaning to visit for months. 2 floors, packed shelves, the specific particular silence of a place where people are absorbed in other worlds. She was standing in the history section, reading the back cover of a book about the Joseon period, when she became aware of someone standing 2 shelves away. She looked up. He was reading. Or rather, he was holding a book open and looking at it with that same unreadable focus he'd directed at her in the parking structure. He was dressed differently today, dark trousers, a simple gray knit, nothing that announced him. He looked, in that moment, like someone who had deliberately chosen not to be who he was for a few hours. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Zara, because she had grown up with a mother who believed that silence was something you filled before it filled you, said, "The imaging was clear." "Yes," he said. "You told me it would be." "I told you it might be. There's a distinction." He tilted his head slightly, the way people do when something earns a point they weren't planning to concede. "There is," he agreed. She put the Joseon book back on the shelf. "Why are you here, Mr. Sean?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She was learning to read the different textures of his silences. This one was honest. Considering. "I'm not entirely certain," he said. And then, as if the admission surprised him as much as it surprised her, "That's an unusual situation for me." They had coffee in the small cafe attached to the bookshop. He sat across from her at a wooden table by the window, both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug and the ordinariness of it. This man who had been described to her in fragments over the following weeks by whispered conversations she hadn't meant to overhear. By a search engine result, she had typed his name into at 2 in the morning and immediately closed. The ordinariness of him sitting with a coffee cup was something she couldn't quite orient herself around. "You looked me up," he said. She didn't bother denying it. "You're not exactly obscure." "What did you find?" "Enough to know that the flowers were a poor decision on your part." She looked at him steadily. "My hospital has administrators who notice things. I'll be more careful." "Mr. Sean." She set down her cup. "I don't need you to be more careful. I need you to understand that I'm not a person who exists in the category of things you can—" She paused, choosing the word deliberately. "Arrange." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not offense, not cold recalibration. Something more complex. Something that, if she'd been less guarded, she might have called respect deepening into something without a clean name. "I know," he said quietly. "That's the part one can't stop thinking about." The cafe hummed around them. Outside, the gray afternoon rain began, soft, unhurried. The kind that soul does better than almost anywhere, the kind that makes the streets gleam like dark mirrors. Zara picked up her coffee again. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not about business. Not the version you give people. Something actual." He was very still. "I haven't slept more than 4 hours consecutively in 11 years, he said. "I've been trying to remember what I wanted before I was given something to want for me. I can't." She absorbed that. "That's the loneliest thing I've heard this month," she said. "And I work in a hospital." He didn't respond. But she saw something shift in the set of his shoulders, infinitesimal, barely there, like a building that had been braced against a wind that had, unexpectedly, gone quiet. Over the following 6 weeks, they met 7 more times. Always in public places. Always casually, a museum, a market, twice more in that bookshop. Once at a pojangmaka near Naxon Park where they sat on plastic stools and ate tteokbokki in the cold, and she told him about her grandmother's village outside Accra, and he listened with the focused attention of someone who had forgotten how to listen and was relearning it in real time. She learned things. She learned that his father had handed him the organization's leadership at 26, without asking if he wanted it, presenting it as inheritance, as inevitability, as honor. She learned that he had a younger sister named Sian Ariam who was studying architecture in Montreal and whom he protected from every aspect of his world with a ferocity that was the most unguarded thing about him. She learned that he had a habit of arriving places early, not because he was anxious, but because he liked the moment before the thing began, when everything was still possible and nothing had been decided yet. She learned that he laughed, rarely and briefly, and always at something she said that she hadn't realized was funny until she heard him. He learned things too. She saw him absorbing them, Her straightforwardness, her refusal to soften truths, the specific way she occupied space with an ease she'd earned after years of being a black woman in rooms that didn't always widen to receive her. He watched the way she moved through the world, and she could see him understanding something he hadn't had words for before. But there were other things she noticed. The way the second man, whose name was Woo Tae-sung, she'd learned, and who functioned as something between a lieutenant and a conscience, watched her with an expression that was not hostility, but concern. The concern of someone who understood that what was happening was going to cost something enormous, and who loved the person it was going to cost. The phone calls Jae-won would step away to take. The way he came back from them with that controlled stillness fully reassembled over his face, whatever had been present during their conversation smoothed back under the surface. And the evening he was 20 minutes late to meet her at the Naxon Park entrance, and when he arrived, she saw, in the orange dusk light, before he had time to arrange himself, that his hands were shaking.
She didn't ask.
He didn't explain, but something solidified in her chest that evening. Something she was not ready to name, but could no longer pretend wasn't there. The fracture, when it came, arrived from a direction she hadn't anticipated. His name was Baek Sung-min. She learned this later, and he was the head of an allied organization whose relationship with Si and Jae-won went back 18 years, to arrangements made by their fathers before either of them had a choice. He was, by all accounts, a man who believed that the world he moved in operated by specific rules, and that those rules existed to protect structures more important than any individual. He had been watching, and in the second week of November, he sent a message, not to Jae-won, but through a mutual intermediary, that landed in the ecosystem around Zara like a stone into still water, sending out rings she couldn't yet see. The message was simple: the association is a liability. It ends, or the consequences extend to the doctor. Jae-won received this message on a Thursday. Zara spent Thursday morning doing rounds, ate lunch at her desk, texted him to confirm their Saturday plans at Buckshin, and thought nothing of the fact that he read the message and did not reply for 2 hours.
She didn't know.
Not yet. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the way November holds Seoul at the end of the month. Not violent cold, but intimate cold, the kind that gets into the spaces between things. Zara was at the Buckshin Hanok Village entrance at 10 a.m. She waited. He didn't come. At 10:40, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, a different unknown number than the one that had called her from the parking garage 8 weeks ago. There are things about the man you've been spending time with that you should understand. His name is not simply Si and Jae-won. Look up Chongpa Group. Look up what happened in Busan in 2019. Then decide if your Saturdays are worth what they cost. She stood in the cold street of the Hanok village, stone walls and tiled roofs rising around her, tourists moving past with cameras and warm drinks, and she read the message 3 times. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked to a nearby cafe, ordered an Americano, and sat for a long time with her hands around the cup, staring at nothing in particular. She didn't look up Chongpa Group that day. Not because she was afraid of what she'd find, but because she had already made a decision about something, and she wanted to examine that decision before any new information changed its shape. The decision was this: she had never pretended she didn't know who he moved through the world as. She had never been naive enough to believe that a man like him, careful, controlled, arriving places early and watching exits, existed in a clean and simple world. She had known in the abstract what he was adjacent to. What she was sitting with now was more specific, more dangerous, more real. When he called that evening, she answered. "I'm sorry about this morning," he said. His voice was different, still controlled, but with something underneath it that she had never heard there before. A thinness, like the surface of ice in early winter, when it looks solid but transmits the cold through to your feet. "Are you safe?" she said. A pause.
"Curly," he said.
Jae-won. She used his given name. She had started doing so 3 weeks ago, and she still felt him receive it each time like something he was allowing himself. "Tell me what's happening." Another pause. Longer. "There's been a communication," he said carefully, "from someone who believes our friendship represents a strategic vulnerability." She absorbed the phrasing. Our friendship. The precision of it, using the word they'd been orbiting around without landing on, using it now in the context of threat. What kind of communication? The kind that comes with implications. Directed at me. You should consider. Directed at me, she repeated. Not a question this time. Yes, he said quietly. She was quiet for a moment. Outside her apartment window, the Han River was dark and dotted with the reflections of the Mapo Bridge lights. I need you to hear something, she said. Not as a doctor. Not as someone who is being careful or measured. As a person talking to another person. She paused. I am not someone who retreats because she's been threatened. I grew up on 3 continents. I've been the only Black woman in more rooms than I can count, and every single time someone implied that my presence was a problem to be managed, I stayed, and I did the work anyway. So whatever Baek Sung-min or whoever sent that message thinks he knows about what I'll do when I'm frightened, she stopped. He doesn't know me. The silence on his end lasted so long that she checked the screen to see if the call was still connected. How do you know his name? Jae-won said finally. I didn't. Until just now. Another silence. You just did that deliberately, he said. I needed to know if my guess was accurate. She paused. It was. He came to her apartment the following morning. He stood in her doorway in the plain gray knit she'd come to think of as a civilian armor, and she let him in and made coffee, and they sat at her small kitchen table the way they'd sat in cafes and markets and bookshops, across from each other, honest distance between them, and she watched him try to find where to begin. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I've been telling myself wasn't necessary. Then tell me. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug she'd given him, the same gesture as the bookshop, the same specific way he held things that were warm. She'd noticed that before and hadn't analyzed it until now. Champa Group has been under investigation for 18 months, he said. Not by police that I can manage. By a financial crimes unit working in cooperation with 3 separate government bodies. They've been building towards something. He looked at his coffee. Someone inside my organization has been feeding them material. Someone close to you? Very. Do you know who? I've known for 6 weeks, he said. She held very still. 6 weeks, she said quietly. Before Baek Sung-min's message. Before. And you didn't move against them?
No.
Why? He looked up from the coffee then, directly at her, with those dark eyes that she had spent 8 weeks learning to read, and she saw in them something that rearranged everything she thought she understood about what had been building between them. Because if I moved against them, he said, it would have required me to do things I've been deciding for the first time in my life that I no longer want to do. The kitchen was very quiet. You've been choosing, she said slowly. Yes. Since when? He was quiet for a moment. Then, since a parking garage in Itaewon. At approximately 3 in the morning, Zara set down her coffee cup very carefully on the table. She had known somewhere below the level of language, that this was the shape of what was happening. But knowing the shape of something and having it placed in front of you with that kind of plainness are 2 entirely different experiences, and she sat with it for a long moment, feeling it expand in the space of the small kitchen. You've been building towards something, she said. Some kind of exit. I've been trying to understand if an exit was possible, he said. Whether there was a version of it that didn't leave everyone around me destroyed. And Baek Sung-min's message changed the calculation. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Because the version of me that existed before you would have made a different set of decisions at that point. The version of me that existed before you would have treated the threat as operational information and acted accordingly. Efficiently. Without, he stopped. Without what? Without it meaning anything, he said. About the shape of who I want to be. Woo Tae-sung arrived at her apartment door at noon. He stood in the hallway, that familiar expression of burdened loyalty on his face, and spoke directly and quietly. He apologized to Zara first. She was startled by this, by the formality and the sincerity of it, and then he turned to Jae-won. It's moving faster than we anticipated, he said. The investigation is 3 weeks from filing. Baek knows about the investigation and is planning to use it to offer cooperation in exchange for isolation from the consequences. He'll give them everything on Champa Group. He'll give them you.
He paused.
And he'll frame the dissolution as your choice. Your failure. A man who went soft. His eyes moved briefly to Zara. then back, because of an attachment. Jae-won was quiet. What happens if you get ahead of it? Zara said. Both men looked at her. I'm asking a practical question, she said. If you cooperate first, if you choose the terms, what happens to the organization, to the people inside it, to you? Everything changes, Tae-sung said carefully. Yes, she said. That was the premise of the question. Jae-won looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, something she had never seen there before, in all the weeks of bookshops and pojangmaka and gray Sunday afternoons. Something unguarded and enormous and quiet all at once. She's asking, he said to Tae-sung, whether the architecture can be rebuilt if the foundation is deliberately dismantled rather than collapsed. I'm asking, Zara said, whether the man I've been having Saturday mornings with has been planning to burn his own empire down before anyone else could do it for him. Silence. Yes, Jae-won said. The next 48 hours moved in a way that she could only describe, later, as geological. Massive and slow and full of pressures invisible from the surface. She went to work.
She did her rounds.
She checked on a patient recovering from cardiac surgery and listened to a family's anxious questions and answered them with the steady, grounded calm that she had built over years. She ate dinner at her desk. She did not check her phone for 45 minutes at a time, which was, for these 48 hours, an act of considerable discipline. At 11 p.m. on the second night, a call came from an unknown number. She answered. It's done, Jae-won said. His voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. Stripped of everything, the control, the measured distance, the architecture of careful stillness he wore like a second skin. What was underneath was something raw and exhausted and, strangely, lighter. I made the call 2 hours ago. Tae-sung is with the legal team. The formal documentation goes in tomorrow morning. Are you safe? She said. The same first question. She would always ask it first.
For now, he said.
The next several months will be, he paused, searching for the word, structural. And Beck. He'll find out tomorrow that I was 3 days ahead of him. He'll have nothing to offer because everything he planned to give them, I've already provided, with context he wasn't prepared for. There was something in his voice, not satisfaction, not triumph. Something more muted and more real. He expected me to protect the empire. What did you protect instead? A pause. The possibility, he said, of being a person worth knowing. The city moved outside her window. Somewhere below, a night bus passed, its windows glowing amber in the dark street. The Han River lay beyond everything, patient and indifferent and vast.
Jae-won, she said.
Yes. You understand that nothing about what comes next is simple. I know. You understand that I didn't ask you to do this.
I know, he said.
That's not why I did it. She was quiet for a moment. The weight of the past hours, the past weeks, the past months settled around her like the city settling into its own dark, not heavy, exactly.
Dense. Full.
Go sleep, she said finally. More than 4 hours. For once. She heard him exhale. Long and slow and complete, like a breath he had been holding since long before she met him. I'll try, he said. 3 days later, Seon Jae-won walked into Severance Hospital at 8 in the morning. Not for treatment. Not as a patient. He found Zara in the corridor outside the cardiology ward, still in her white coat, hair pulled back, looking at a chart with the deep focus expression she wore when she was sorting something difficult. She looked up and saw him. He was carrying 2 coffees from a small shop on the ground floor. He held one out to her. She looked at the coffee. Then at him. Then at the corridor around them. Colleagues moving past. The ordinary machinery of a hospital morning. The fluorescent lights that never changed. She took the coffee. There will be hearings, he said quietly. Formal proceedings. My name will be public in ways it hasn't been before. I know. It will be complicated. For anyone associated with me. Jae-won. She looked at him directly. I treated a stranger in a parking garage in the middle of the night because it was the right thing to do. I've made a series of choices since then based on who I observed you to be, not who other people told me you were. She paused. I don't require your life to be uncomplicated. I require it to be honest. He was quiet for a long moment, The hospital moved around them. My sister's coming from Montreal next week, he said at last. She's been asking about you. Zara raised an eyebrow. You told your sister about me. She has a habit of finding things out, he said. It runs in the family. Zara looked at him, at this man who had been, in the span of 4 months, a stranger, a patient, a presence, a revelation, and felt something she had no particular interest in naming yet. Some things were better left in the space between their true shape and the words that would eventually find them. Tell her, Zara said, that I'll make time. But that evening, walking to the subway after her shift, she received one more message. Not from Jaewon. Not from Taesung. Not from any number she recognized. 3 words sent from a number that traced to nothing when she checked. He didn't tell you everything. She stopped on the pavement, commuters flowing around her, the cold evening air of Seoul pressing in from all sides. She read the message again. Her coffee cup, long empty, was still in her hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then up at the Han River overpass in the middle distance, lit orange against the darkening sky. He didn't tell you everything. She put her phone in her pocket. She thought about the man who had arrived at her hospital this morning with 2 coffees. The man who had told her, with a directness that had cost him something, that he was choosing a different shape for himself. The man who, she had watched this happen in real time, in bookshops and pojangmaka and kitchen tables, had been quietly, methodically, learning to want something that was genuinely his. She thought about what she knew about him, and then she thought about everything she didn't. The subway entrance was ahead of her. She descended the steps into the warm underground current of the city, the hum of the trains beneath her feet, the crowd of evening commuters pressing around her. She had 3 minutes until her train. She stood on the platform and took out her phone and looked at the message one more time. He didn't tell you everything. Around her, the platform filled and breathed. A train arrived. Doors opened. People moved. She didn't get on. Thought balloon here is the question this story leaves in the room. When someone chooses you, genuinely, entirely at great cost, does the truth of what they haven't yet told you change the meaning of the choice, or does the choice itself tell you everything you actually need to know?